Imagine this. A young man wakes up before sunrise, rushes into his car, and drives across the city to make it to the gym. Later, he heads into the office, juggling emails, deadlines, and meetings. He works late, scrolling on his phone before bed, wondering why he still feels restless. He tells himself, "One day when I've achieved more, when I finally get everything in order, then I'll be at peace." Doesn't that sound familiar? Maybe you've thought the same way. We live in a world that tells us happiness is somewhere ahead, just beyond the horizon. We chase promotions, possessions, relationships, even spiritual milestones, as if peace and freedom are prizes waiting at the finish line. And so, people approach enlightenment the same way. We imagine it as a mystical destination, a mountaintop where the enlightened sit in eternal calm, far away from the noise of ordinary life. We picture it as an achievement, a badge of honor earned after years of discipline. We dream of it as a place where suffering disappears and we finally arrive. But here's the paradox. The more we chase, the further it seems to slip away. Like trying to catch the horizon, the goal always moves with us. The Buddha himself once lived this chase. Born a prince, he had comfort, wealth, and luxury, but none of it answered the ache inside. He left it all behind, wandering for years, seeking answers in every teaching he could find. He pushed his body to extremes, starving, punishing, exhausting himself, believing that somewhere out there, if he searched long and hard enough, he would finally uncover the truth. But what happened? The truth revealed itself only when he stopped running, not in a hidden cave, not in a distant land, not in some other life. It happened when he sat quietly under a Bodhi tree, right where he was. That moment of stillness shattered the illusion that enlightenment was somewhere far away. It wasn't about reaching a special place. It wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about seeing clearly, seeing reality as it truly is. And this is the illusion we live under every single day. We think peace will come when we fix our circumstances. We think freedom will come once we've earned it. We think wisdom is stored somewhere outside of us, waiting for us to travel there. But what if the door was never locked? What if what you've been searching for has been closer than your own breath? What if enlightenment is not a journey forward but a turning inward? Think about it. A fish spends its whole life searching for water, never realizing it's already swimming in it. We are the same. We search for enlightenment as though it were separate from us, not realizing it saturates every moment. The real challenge is not how far we must go, but how willing we are to stop running, to stop believing the story that we are incomplete, to stop imagining that freedom is far away. This is not to say the path is easy. Our minds are restless travelers. They cling to the past, fantasize about the future, and constantly insist, not here, not now, somewhere else. And yet every tradition, every teaching, every parable points back to this single truth. The miracle is here. The miracle is now. When you hear the word enlightenment, maybe you picture a shining light, a sacred vision, or a perfect state where all problems vanish. But what if it's far more ordinary, and at the same time infinitely more profound? What if enlightenment is simply opening your eyes fully to the life unfolding right where you stand? A Zen master once said, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." It sounds almost disappointing until you realize the point. Nothing magical appears after awakening. The world doesn't suddenly change. You do. Your vision clears. What once felt ordinary now pulses with wonder. Maybe enlightenment is not about escaping the noise of life but hearing its music. Not about erasing suffering but seeing it in its true nature. Not about leaving the world behind but meeting it as it is without distortion. And if that's true, then the question changes. It's no longer, how do I get there? It becomes, can I see here? This realization is both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling, because it strips away our excuses. We can no longer blame distance, time, or circumstance. Liberating, because it means the possibility of awakening is available to anyone, right now, without waiting for a perfect moment. So maybe enlightenment is not about climbing a mountain after all. Maybe it's about stopping long enough to notice that the ground beneath your feet has always been sacred. And yet, despite its simplicity, most of us miss it. Why? Because we've been conditioned to chase, to strive, to believe that only in the next place, the next stage, the next achievement will we finally arrive. But if enlightenment is already here, then why do so many of us keep running? Why do we continue to search outside, hoping the answer lies in some distant destination? We live in a culture built on chasing. From the moment we're children, we're taught that life is a ladder, climb high enough and you'll finally reach what you're looking for. Good grades lead to good schools. Good schools lead to good jobs. Good jobs lead to money, status, and recognition. And somewhere at the top of all of this, we're promised happiness. So naturally, when we hear the word enlightenment, we apply the same logic. We think, if I meditate enough, if I read enough books, if I practice the right rituals, then maybe one day I'll achieve enlightenment. We treat it like the ultimate trophy at the end of life's marathon. But here lies the great misunderstanding. The very mindset of chasing, of constantly running towards something, is the barrier itself. It's like trying to calm a pool of water by splashing it. The more energy we throw at it, the more turbulence we create. And yet, millions of seekers throughout history have made this same mistake. They believe enlightenment is a destination, waiting for them far away at the end of countless practices. They search across temples, through mountains, under teachers, and within texts. But enlightenment is not an external possession. It's not a rare jewel hidden in a faraway land. It is more like the sky, always present even when clouds block our view. Think about it. Have you ever wanted something so badly that you couldn't stop thinking about it? A relationship, a promotion, a personal goal. And then, when you finally got it, the satisfaction lasted only for a moment before the craving returned. That's the pattern of desire. And chasing enlightenment with the same hunger transforms it into just another desire, another object of craving, another illusion of someday. A famous Zen story illustrates this beautifully. A young monk asked his teacher, "How long will it take me to be enlightened if I practice really hard?" The master replied, 10 years. The monk, eager and ambitious, said, "But what if I practice twice as hard?" The master paused, then said, 20 years. The lesson is clear. The harder we chase, the further it slips away. Enlightenment cannot be forced because it's not something to acquire, it's something to recognize. This misunderstanding comes from the way we view life itself. We see everything as a transaction, effort in, reward out. We train our bodies and they grow stronger. We study and we gain knowledge. So we assume enlightenment must work the same way. Practice long enough and you'll arrive at some final stage. But the truth is, enlightenment is not the result of practice. It is the recognition that what you are seeking is already here beneath all the layers of striving. The Buddha himself exposed this error. Before his awakening, he practiced extreme forms of asceticism. He starved his body to skin and bones, believing suffering would unlock the truth. Yet nothing happened. Only when he abandoned the chase, when he sat beneath the Bodhi tree with no more striving, did clarity dawn. This is the paradox. Practice is necessary, but not in the way we think. We practice not to earn enlightenment, but to clear away the illusions that prevent us from seeing it. It's like polishing a mirror. We don't polish to create a reflection. The reflection was always there. We polish to remove the dust. But when we treat enlightenment like a prize to be won, add more dust, more craving, more ego, we tell ourselves, I will become enlightened, which secretly means I will become greater, more special, more extraordinary than others. And in that very thought, the essence of enlightenment slips through our fingers. Because enlightenment is not about becoming extraordinary. It is about seeing the extraordinariness of the ordinary. It is not about rising above humanity. It is about being fully human. Let's pause for a moment. Look around you right now. The sound you hear, the breath you take, the sensation of sitting in your chair, all of it is part of the living truth of this moment. Yet we overlook it, believing that truth is waiting elsewhere at some higher plane. This blindness is the great misunderstanding. And here's the irony. The harder people chase, the more restless they become. The more restless they become, the further they feel from awakening. It's like a dog chasing its own tail. The faster it spins, the more dizzy it gets, never realizing the tail was part of itself all along. What if instead of running we stopped? What if instead of striving to reach we opened our eyes to see? That shift in perspective changes everything. But to understand this shift deeply, we must look back at the story of the Buddha himself, not as a myth, not as a distant legend, but as a human being who walked the same path of confusion, striving, and finally awakening, because his story holds the mirror to our own chase. And in that story, we may discover the secret we've been missing all along. For years, Siddhartha Gautama, the man who would become the Buddha, searched relentlessly. He left behind his palace, his wealth, his family. He wandered from teacher to teacher, learning every meditation, every ritual, every philosophy that promised freedom from suffering. But still, the hunger inside remained. Imagine his desperation. He was a prince who had given up everything, yet no answer came. Instead of peace, he found more questions. Instead of clarity, more shadows. So he pushed harder. He believed that if he punished his body, starved his desires, and endured enough pain, maybe, just maybe, the universe would reveal its secret. He practiced extreme asceticism until his body wasted away, ribs pressing against skin so weak he could barely stand. And then something shifted. One day, as he collapsed from exhaustion, a young girl offered him a simple bowl of milk rice. At first, he resisted. Accepting food felt like failure, but in that moment, something profound dawned on him. Starvation would not lead to truth. Neither luxury nor self-torture could unlock awakening. Both were extremes and both kept him trapped. This insight would later become known as the middle way, the path between indulgence and denial. But still, the question remained, if not through wealth and not through suffering, then how? So Siddhartha walked to a quiet place near the Naranjara river. He sat beneath a large fig tree, what we now call the Bodhi tree, and there he made a vow. I will not rise from this seat until I have found the truth. Now picture that moment. Not a king on a throne, not a holy man in grand robes, but a thin, weary seeker sitting cross-legged under a tree, alone, silent, unmoving. As the hours passed, his mind confronted its deepest fears. Memories arose, desires clawed at him, doubts whispered, "Who are you to think you can awaken? You are nothing." These voices, these temptations, were later described as Mara, the embodiment of delusion. But Siddhartha did not fight. He did not run. He simply observed. He saw the fears. He saw the desires. He saw the illusions, and in seeing them clearly, they began to lose their power. Then, as dawn approached, something extraordinary happened. The story says that in the silence of early morning, as the first light touched the horizon, Siddhartha looked deep into the nature of existence. He saw that life was marked by impermanence. Everything changes, everything arises and passes. He saw that suffering is born from attachment, from clinging to what cannot last. And he saw that freedom lies in letting go, seeing reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. In that moment, Siddhartha awakened. He was no longer the seeker. He was the Buddha, the awakened one. But notice carefully what this means. He didn't travel somewhere else. He didn't step into another world. He didn't become something new. He simply saw clearly what had always been true. Under that Bodhi tree, the great illusion was shattered. Enlightenment was not hidden in distance. It was not waiting at the end of some journey. It was here, beneath his feet, within his breath, in the stillness of this very moment. This is why his story resonates so deeply across centuries, because it is not just his story, it is ours. We too chase happiness through extremes. We overindulge, then we swing to denial. We chase success, then we burn out in exhaustion. We keep hoping that somewhere in some future state we'll finally feel whole. But the Bodhi tree reminds us, stop running, sit down, look deeply. What you're searching for is not hiding, it's right where you are. The Buddha's awakening was not a magical transformation. The stars did not rearrange, the rivers did not change course. What changed was his vision. He saw through the illusions that bind us. He saw the truth that had always been here. And that is the invitation for us, to sit with ourselves, to stop running from discomfort, To stop believing the story that someday will be better than today. Awakening is not an escape. It is an encounter with reality, raw and unfiltered. But here's the challenge. Most of us find it nearly impossible to stop. Our minds resist stillness. They keep telling us move, strive, achieve. We confuse motion with progress, and in doing so, we miss the very thing we're running after. So the question becomes, why do we keep forgetting the treasure beneath our feet? Why do we overlook the simple truth that the Buddha discovered under that tree? The answer lies in the way we treat the present moment. We've learned to dismiss it, to trade it for fantasies of the future. We are like travelers searching for gold while sitting on a chest full of it. This blindness is not a small mistake. It is the very root of suffering. And if we want to understand enlightenment in our own lives, we must first understand why we ignore the here and now. There is a strange paradox in human life. We live every second inside the present moment, yet it is the one place we almost never visit. Our minds are restless travelers. They wander into the past, replaying old mistakes, clinging to old joys. They sprint into the future, chasing possibilities, fearing losses that haven't even arrived. Meanwhile, the present, the only reality we truly have, slips through our fingers like water. This is what the Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree, that freedom is not hidden in some faraway land. It is in the here and now. But the here and now is the very treasure we have forgotten. Think about your own life. How many meals have you eaten without really tasting them? How many conversations have you had without truly listening? How many moments of beauty have passed you by because you were too busy looking at a screen, planning the next thing, rushing to the next goal? We live surrounded by treasures, yet we walk past them as if blind. Imagine a poor man living in a small, crumbling hut. He spends his days worrying about survival, dreaming of riches that might one day save him. What he doesn't know is that, buried beneath his very floor, is a chest of gold. Every night he sleeps above it. Every morning he steps over it. And yet, because he never looks down, he dies believing he was poor. This is us. The gold is the present moment. The hut is our restless mind. We long for treasure far away, not realizing it lies beneath our feet. The Buddha called this tathata, Suchness. It means seeing things as they are without distortion. A tree is simply a tree. A bird sings simply because it sings. The present moment is already whole, already complete. But because we want more, because we expect something else, we miss the wonder of what is right in front of us. Children understand this naturally. Watch a child play in the rain. She doesn't worry about tomorrow's weather. She doesn't regret yesterday's sunshine. She simply feels the drops on her skin, laughs and dances. For her, the present is enough. Somewhere along the way, as we grow older, we lose that. We trade presence for ambition, wonder for worry. Modern life makes this even harder. Our phones buzz with endless notifications. Advertisements tell us happiness is one purchase away. Social media convinces us that everyone else's life is happening out there. In some other place we are not. The result, we're pulled away from here, seduced by an illusion of there. But here is the truth, there is no there. When tomorrow arrives, it will arrive only as today. When your dreams come true, you will experience them only in the now. Life has never unfolded anywhere else. This is why mindfulness is so powerful. It is not a mystical trick. It is simply the art of remembering to be here, to breathe, to notice, to return to the only place you ever really live. Present moment is not glamorous. It doesn't promise fireworks, but it holds everything. It is the place where you can truly taste food, where you can truly hear music, where you can truly see another human being. It is where love happens, where healing happens, where awakening happens. One Zen master described enlightenment in 3 simple words. This is it. Not tomorrow, not someday, this. And yet we resist it. Why? Because the present often contains discomfort, the ache of loneliness, the weight of stress, the sting of regret. We think if we run far enough we can escape these feelings, but running only multiplies them. Avoidance is the fuel of suffering. The forgotten treasure of now is not that it erases pain, it's that it reveals pain for what it truly is, passing, impermanent, not the whole of who we are. When you breathe into this moment, even suffering becomes workable. It softens, it teaches, it dissolves. So why do we keep overlooking this treasure? Because our culture celebrates becoming, not being. We're told, don't stop, keep moving, keep improving. The good life is always just ahead. But the Bodhi tree whispers something radically different. Stop, look. Everything you're searching for is already here. It's almost too simple for our complicated minds to accept. We want enlightenment to be dramatic, extraordinary, something reserved for saints and sages. But the truth is, it is ordinary, and that's what makes it extraordinary. Consider this: the next breath you take is a miracle. Without it, nothing else is possible. And yet, how often do you notice it? The forgotten treasure is not hidden in sacred texts or faraway temples. It is hidden in plain sight, in the rise and fall of your breath, the beating of your heart, the sound of life around you. And once you see this treasure, even the most ordinary acts shine with a new light. Washing dishes becomes meditation. Walking to the store becomes prayer. Sitting with a friend becomes a doorway to eternity. This is what the Buddha realized under the Bodhi tree. Not that life must be escaped, but that life must be seen. Not that we must seek somewhere else, but that we must wake up right here. So the question is not, where do we go to find enlightenment? The question is, why do we keep running away from it? We are dreamers by nature. From childhood we're told, one day you'll become someone, a doctor, a leader, a success story. And so we grow up believing that life is a project of becoming, of building, climbing, achieving. Even in spirituality, the same mindset takes root. We whisper to ourselves, if I meditate long enough, if I pray hard enough, if I dedicate every breath to practice, then one day I will become enlightened. But here is the subtle trap. The very desire to become enlightened blinds us from the truth of enlightenment itself. It's like standing in front of a clear pond. If the water is calm, it reflects your face perfectly. But if you keep stirring it, trying to improve the reflection, it only grows cloudy. The harder you strive, the less you see. This is the paradox of becoming. The more we chase, the further we drift. The Buddha saw this clearly. Before his awakening, he was caught in the same trap. He believed that if he could push hard enough through extreme fasting, through endless discipline, he would earn the truth. But the harder he chased, the further it slipped away. Only when he stopped striving did awakening reveal itself. In our lives, this trap shows up everywhere. We say, I'll be happy when I get that promotion. I'll feel at peace once I move to a new city. I'll finally love myself when I achieve this goal. But when the promotion comes, when the move happens, when the goal is reached, what then? For a moment, joy appears, and then the cycle begins again. Another desire, another chase. This is why striving can blind us, because it convinces us that life is always not yet, that who we are now is not enough, that peace is always around the next corner. But here's the question. What if there is no corner? What if the very act of chasing is the illusion? There's a story from Zen. A student asked his master, "How do I enter the way?" The master replied, "Do you hear the sound of the stream outside?" "Yes," the student answered. "Enter there," said the master. No special achievement, no grand arrival, just the sound of water right where he stood. The trap of becoming is seductive because it feels productive. Striving gives us the illusion of progress. We feel like we're doing something about our suffering. But in truth, striving often reinforces the very identity we need to let go of. The idea of a separate self that must become something more. Buddhism calls this illusion Anatta, the belief in a solid, permanent I. As long as we cling to this I, we will always chase after its improvement. A better me, a more enlightened me, a perfect me. But enlightenment is not about perfecting the self. It is about seeing through the self altogether. That's why striving can never deliver it. You cannot polish the ego into awakening. Awakening dawns only when you see that the ego itself was the cloud covering the sky. So how do we escape this trap? Not by rejecting effort, but by transforming our relationship with it. Effort is needed, yes, but not effort to become something else. Effort to see what already is. Effort to sit still when the mind wants to run. Effort to stay present when desire pulls us into tomorrow. This is what the Zen masters mean by effortless effort. We practice, but not to add anything new. We practice to peel away what is false. Think of it like sculpting. A block of marble looks solid, but within it lies the form of a statue. The sculptor does not create the statue, he simply removes the excess stone. In the same way, awakening is not created, it is revealed when the excess illusions are carved away. But if we keep saying, "I must become enlightened," then we are still clinging to the block of marble, polishing it, admiring it, never daring to see what lies inside. The irony is almost cruel. The harder you chase enlightenment as a future goal, the further you drift from it. But the moment you stop, truly stop, and see clearly, the trap collapses. This doesn't mean we abandon practice. It means we practice with a new spirit, not to become, but to awaken. Meditation is not a tool to reach enlightenment. It is the space in which you realize it was never absent. The Buddha called this the middle way. Not indulgence, not self-torture, and not striving for some distant identity. Just presence, just seeing, just being. So the question becomes, can you sit without chasing? Can you walk without trying to arrive? Can you breathe without trying to become? Because when you do, a strange thing happens. Life itself begins to reveal its simplicity. The ordinary feels luminous. The restless search quiets, and what once seemed hidden begins to shine right where you are. The trap of becoming dissolves, not because you've reached something new, but because you've finally stopped running from what has always been here. When the Buddha spoke about liberation, he didn't describe it as climbing a mountain or reaching a paradise far away. Instead, he pointed to a radical shift in how we see reality itself. And three key teachings, Anatta, Sunyata, and Tathata, open the doorway to that shift. Let's begin with Anatta, the teaching of no self. From the moment we are born, we're told who we are. A name, a family, a story. We weave together our memories, our dreams, our fears, and we call it me. It feels solid, permanent, unshakable, but the Buddha asked, look closer. Is this self really as fixed as we think? Your body is constantly changing. Cells die, new ones form. The child you once were is gone. Your mind shifts too, thoughts rise, emotions pass, identities change. One moment you say, I am strong. Another moment, I am broken. Which one is the real you? The truth is, this self is like a flame on a candle. It looks continuous, but it is only a process, moment by moment, fueled by conditions. When we cling to it as something solid, we suffer. But when we see through it, when we realize there is no fixed I to defend, improve, or become, an immense freedom opens. Now let's turn to Sunyata, or emptiness. This word can sound cold, even frightening, but it is not a void. It means that nothing exists independently. Everything arises through conditions. Everything is interconnected. Think of a flower. At first glance, you see just a blossom, but look deeper. Within that flower is sunshine, rain, soil, the gardener's care, even the distant stars that produce the elements it is made of. The flower is empty of a separate, independent existence, but in that emptiness it contains the whole universe. And so it is with us. When we feel alone, isolated, cut off, we are trapped in illusion. In truth, we are threads woven into a vast fabric of being. To see emptiness is to see interconnection. And when we see interconnection, compassion naturally arises. Because how can we harm another when, in reality, there is no other? Finally, there is Tathata, Suchness, or the reality of things as they are. We spend much of life wishing things were different. If only this moment were better. If only I were someone else. But Suchness points us back to the miracle of what is here, right now, without distortion. It is the taste of tea just as it is, the sound of rain falling exactly as it falls, the presence of life, raw and unfiltered. When you stop demanding that life be other than it is, Suchness reveals its quiet perfection. Together, these teachings dissolve the illusion of striving. No self shows us there is no permanent I that needs to become enlightened. Emptiness shows us that awakening is not about escaping the world, but realizing our inseparability from it. Suchness shows us that enlightenment is not hidden. It is this moment, seen clearly. Imagine carrying these insights into daily life. You face an insult, not with anger but with the understanding that the self being attacked is a fragile illusion. You feel fear, not with paralysis but with the awareness that feelings arise and pass like clouds in a vast sky. You experience loss, not with despair but with the wisdom that everything is interwoven and ever-changing. This is not abstract philosophy. It is medicine for the restless heart. It is the end of chasing, the end of becoming. Because once you see that there is no fixed I to save, no separate world to conquer, and no reality more real than the suchness of now, the very need to chase dissolves. The Buddha once held up a flower before his disciples. Most waited for his words, but one smiled. That was enough. Awakening was not in the explanation, but in the seeing. And perhaps this is the deepest invitation, to stop searching for meaning as if it were hidden in some distant place, and instead open our eyes to the meaning already shining in everything. Because when we see with the eyes of Anatta, Sunyata, and Tathata, we discover that enlightenment is not about becoming extraordinary. It is about finally noticing the extraordinary within the ordinary. Enlightenment can sound like something distant, reserved for monks in monasteries or sages in the mountains. But the Buddha never taught awakening as something locked away from daily life. He pointed directly to the here and now, to the way we breathe, the way we walk, the way we live. This is where mindfulness comes in. Mindfulness isn't a luxury. It isn't a ritual. It is simply remembering to be present. Consider this. How often do we truly taste our food? Most of the time, we eat while scrolling through a phone or lost in thought. The plate is empty before we even notice the first bite. But when you bring mindfulness to eating, just pausing to feel the texture, the flavor, the warmth, you discover that the simplest meal becomes rich, almost sacred. The same is true for walking. Usually, we walk to get somewhere. But mindfulness transforms walking into arriving with every step. The ground beneath your feet, the rhythm of your body, the quiet miracle of movement, it all becomes alive. Mindfulness reveals that enlightenment isn't hidden in extraordinary moments. It's woven into the ordinary, washing dishes, folding laundry, driving to work. Each act is a doorway if we step through it awake. Why does this matter? Because suffering often hides in our forgetfulness. We get lost in the stories in our heads, the regrets of yesterday, the anxieties of tomorrow, and we miss the only place peace can ever be found, now. The Buddha described mindfulness as the direct path to awakening, not because it creates something new, but because it clears the fog from what is already here. When you are mindful, you begin to notice the subtle beauty of life, the smile of a stranger, the stillness of dawn, the way your breath rises and falls like gentle waves. And this noticing changes everything. Stress loosens its grip because you're no longer trapped in the what-ifs of the future. Loneliness softens because you feel connected to the life around you. Even suffering itself becomes lighter because mindfulness gives you space to meet it with compassion instead of resistance. There's a Zen saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The difference is not in what you do, but in how you do it. Without mindfulness, life feels like a blur of chores. With mindfulness, the same actions become alive with presence. This is everyday enlightenment, not a grand revelation, but a gentle shift. A shift from rushing to arriving, from grasping to noticing, from chasing a distant goal to recognizing the treasure already in your hands. And perhaps the most beautiful part, you don't have to change your life to practice this. You don't need to escape your job, your family, your responsibilities. You simply bring awareness into what you're already doing. When you listen, truly listen, without preparing your reply, you touch enlightenment. When you breathe deeply in the middle of a storm of stress, you touch enlightenment. When you smile at the small wonders of life, a flower, a child's laughter, the warmth of sunlight, you touch enlightenment. This doesn't mean life will become free of pain, but it means you won't add suffering on top of pain, because mindfulness teaches you to see reality as it is, without judgment, without escape. And in that clear seeing, wisdom and compassion naturally arise. The Buddha didn't awaken in some other world. He awakened under a tree, sitting on the earth, breathing the same air we breathe. His enlightenment wasn't about leaving life, it was about fully entering it. And so the invitation is simple. Don't wait for enlightenment to appear as a lightning bolt. Let it bloom in the very fabric of your day, in the breath you are taking right now, in the step you are walking right now. Because when you practice mindfulness, you begin to see that enlightenment isn't a separate event. It is life itself, fully lived. There's a strange tension at the heart of the spiritual path. On one hand, the Buddha urged us to practice diligently, to cultivate mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. On the other hand, he also taught that awakening cannot be forced, that clinging to the goal only pushes it further away. This is the paradox of effort and non-effort. Think of trying to fall asleep. You can't force it. The more you tell yourself, "I must sleep now," the more restless you become. But at the same time, sleep doesn't happen without creating the right conditions: quiet, stillness, a soft bed. You prepare, but then you let go. Awakening is much the same. Effort is like tending a garden. You pull weeds, water the soil, give it sunlight. But no matter how hard you strain, you cannot make the plant grow. Growth happens in its own time, its own way. What you can do is create the conditions and then allow. This is why the Buddha called his path the middle way. Not indulgence, not self-torture, not passivity, not obsessive striving. It is the balance point, the harmony between doing and being. In practice, this balance is subtle. If you put in no effort at all, the mind drifts into distraction. If you push too hard, the mind tightens into struggle. The sweet spot lies in steady, relaxed awareness, a discipline without tension, a presence without grasping. Zen teachers sometimes describe it as trying without trying. It sounds like a riddle, but you've felt it before. Think of a time you were fully absorbed in something you loved: painting, running, music, even cooking. You were putting forth effort, yes, but it didn't feel heavy. There was flow, ease, almost a sense that life itself was carrying you. That is the spirit of non-effort with an effort. In meditation, this paradox becomes clear. At first, you try hard, sit straight, control the breath, wrestle with thoughts. But over time, you realize that forcing only creates tension. The real practice is gentler. You sit, you breathe, you notice, and then you allow the mind to settle on its own. Like muddy water in a jar, if you stop shaking it, clarity appears naturally. And here's the beauty. This paradox isn't just for meditation. It's for life itself. We all know the exhaustion of overstriving, working endlessly, chasing goals, demanding results. But we also know the stagnation of giving up, of letting apathy take over. Neither extreme brings peace. The middle way invites us to show up fully but without clinging to outcomes. Imagine working on a project. You give it your best, but instead of obsessing over whether people will praise it or whether it will succeed, you simply let it be your offering. You care deeply, but you don't grasp tightly. That's the balance. Or imagine raising a child. You nurture, you guide, you protect, but you also recognize that life flows beyond your control. You can't script every detail. At some point, you have to trust, to let go, to allow your child to grow in their own way. This is the paradox of effort and non-effort. We engage with life wholeheartedly, but without the desperate need to control its every turn. In Buddhist philosophy, this balance is often likened to tuning a stringed instrument. If the string is too loose, it won't play. If it's too tight, it snaps. Only when tuned just right does it produce music. Our practice, our lives are the same. What makes this paradox so powerful is that it dissolves the trap of becoming. If you practice only with effort, you're always reaching into the future, always straining to be somewhere else. If you abandon effort completely, you sink into distraction and delusion. But when effort and non-effort merge, you discover the truth of now. And in that space, awakening is no longer something you chase. It is something that unfolds quietly, naturally, like a flower opening to the sun. So perhaps the invitation is simple. Practice with sincerity but without strain. Show up but let go. Walk the path but stop trying to arrive. Because when effort and non-effort meet, the journey itself becomes the destination. Wisdom is often too vast for explanation alone. Words can guide, but they can also trap. That's why the Buddha and the masters of the past used stories and parables, living images that bypass the intellect and touch the heart directly. One of the most famous parables says, "The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon." Teachings, scriptures, even meditation techniques, they are the finger. They direct our gaze. But if we mistake the finger for the moon, we miss the beauty shining in the night sky. This parable reminds us that enlightenment is not in the words but in the seeing. The teachings are a map, but the journey is your own. There's a Zen story that captures this perfectly. A student came to his master desperate. "Please," he begged, "show me the truth. Give me the secret to enlightenment." The master said nothing. Instead, he simply pointed to the sky where the full moon glowed. The student looked at the finger, waiting for more. The master whispered, "Look beyond the finger." And in that silence, the lesson was clear. The point was never the pointing, the point was to look. In another story, a monk asked the Buddha, "What is enlightenment?" The Buddha simply lifted a flower. The monk was confused, but one disciple smiled. That smile was enough. Awakening was not in the explanation, but in the direct seeing of Suchness, the simple flower shining with reality just as it was. Why do these stories matter? Because they free us from the trap of overthinking. We live in a world obsessed with explanations, steps, and formulas. But awakening cannot be reduced to a checklist. It is more like the moment you notice the fragrance of jasmine drifting through the air. No one can explain it to you. You must breathe it in yourself. And so the masters used paradox and humor to break through the rigid walls of the mind. A monk once asked, "What is the essence of Buddhism?" The master replied, "Your everyday mind." The monk pressed, "Then should I try to cultivate it?" The master said, "If you try, you miss it." These stories may seem puzzling, but that's the point. They are designed to jolt us out of linear thinking, to stop us from chasing with the mind what can only be seen with awareness. It's like being lost in the desert, endlessly studying maps, while forgetting to look up and see the stars that could guide you home. The teachings point, but the seeing is yours. Perhaps you've had such a moment in your own life, a sunset so breathtaking you forgot your name, a child's laughter so pure it silenced every worry, a deep silence where thought itself fell away. That clarity is not something new, it is simply the veil lifting for a moment. The stories of the masters invite us to recognize that clarity, to realize it is always here. But here's the subtle danger. We can also become attached to the stories themselves. We memorize them, debate them, turn them into doctrines. And once again, the finger becomes the object of our fascination, while the moon waits unnoticed in the sky. That's why the true masters never wanted followers who worshiped their words. They wanted seekers who looked directly at reality. As one teacher said, "Do not mistake the raft for the shore." So the question for us is simple. Are we staring at the finger, or are we lifting our gaze to the moon? Are we clinging to ideas about enlightenment, or are we opening to the direct experience of it? Because in the end, stories and parables are not there to give us answers. They are there to unhook us from the prison of answers, so we can see what was always present. And maybe that's the most beautiful truth of all, that the moon has always been shining. We only needed to look. So we return to where we began. Enlightenment is not a far-off destination, not a prize waiting at the end of a long journey. It is here, now, in this very breath you are taking. The Buddha didn't walk thousands of miles to find awakening. He sat beneath a tree and saw clearly what was already true. The masters who followed did the same. Not by adding something new, but by peeling away illusion until reality revealed itself. And so it is for us. The ordinary moment is the extraordinary teacher. The ground beneath your feet, the air filling your lungs, the sound of life happening all around you. This is the temple. This is the Dharma. This is where awakening blooms. The greatest trap is believing you must become something more before you can be free. The greatest freedom is realizing you are already standing in the place you seek. So take a breath, feel your body. Notice this moment, raw and unfiltered. This is it. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. The path of Buddhism is not about escaping the world. It is about entering it fully, with clarity, with compassion, with presence. Enlightenment is not a goal, it is the seeing of what has always been. And when you understand this, every step becomes sacred, every act becomes practice, every breath becomes awakening. Enlightenment is not out there, it is where you stand. If this reflection touched your heart, let it be a gentle reminder that wisdom is always closer than we think. And if you'd like to keep walking this path with us, learning, reflecting, and discovering the depth of Buddhist teachings, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, not as a transaction, not as another goal, but as a way of staying connected to a community of seekers, all looking at the same moon from different places. So if this resonated with you, take a moment like planting a seed of mindfulness and subscribe. Together we can nurture a space of wisdom, presence, and peace. May your days be light, your steps steady, and your seeing clear. Until we meet again, breathe, be, and remember, enlightenment is already here.